What is it?
For murder, attempted murder, rape, attempted rape, assault. What makes it peculiarly domestic would be where it relates to a child in a home, a spouse in a home, a parent, a grandparent. So there is some element of a familial relationship within the home. That is what gives it its peculiarity of being domestic violence.
I'm talking about being thrown to the ground and kicked about like an animal. I'm talking about blows to the face. I'm talking about being beaten so badly that I ended up with black and blue marks, with bruises, swollen lips, black eyes, everything that you can imagine. I once got hit so hard that I remember well, and I kept the magnetic rollers. I got slammed against a wall so hard, and those rollers are not breakable, that they cracked. Now imagine if there weren't those rollers between my head and the wall, what could have resulted. But that is the level of violence. And I am talking about a situation where, in spite of all that, I would get up the next day and try to cover all that pain and cover all the physical marks and go to work and act normal. So I was walking on an emotional tightrope for most of the time I was in this marriage.
I was raped. One morning I got up and my husband tried to have intercourse with me, and I told him no, because I really didn't want to. And he decided that the answer wasn't going to be no, and he literally ripped off my underwear. And while he was doing it, I started to scream, thinking that he would stop, but he didn't stop. He continued, and he got upset because I started to scream, and he started to slap me up. And it continued, it just continued, it didn't stop.
We realize it's happening, but it doesn't really come to the doctor in quite the same way as you would imagine. It comes through hospitals, it comes through accidents and emergencies. Sometimes it's not diagnosed because nobody comes and says, I'm being battered. So it comes through the various social services, through the social workers. So you might get it in a very oblique way. It comes to the private practitioner who may not be enjoined to say anything about it because of the confidentiality part of it. So it is there, but the doctor really is, I think, one of the worst persons for you to come to for statistics, because the only people who might tell you a lot about it are the forensic doctors who see them on the mortuary slab.
The mortuary slab. That's where 103 women ended up between January 1992 and August 1997. Police records show that approximately 10,000 others, almost all women and children, have made reports of domestic violence since 1991.
There are people who are perpetually depressed, not being able to function, not being able to make proper decisions about any number of things. And then when you go into this story deep down, you realize there is abuse and violence somewhere in the whole basis of everything that's going on. And there is just ill health, vague ill health. You talked about abortions. There have been people who have been abused, particularly in pregnancies. And you talk about children, the emotional abuse that happens, that the hidden things that happen to the child who doesn't perform well in school and then goes on to other things, goes on to crime even if you want to be extreme. But to talk about health hazards, you could talk about every system of the body, you could talk about it in all kinds of headings.
Police officers estimate that the incidence of domestic violence may be twice as high as reported figures, since many women are too afraid of their perpetrators to report battering.
So he's going to reinforce your fear by that control, and mind you, the violence now takes place on several levels. Everybody concentrates on the physical, but in between the batterings, there's also the emotional battering that you suffer, and that takes place on a daily basis. So all the time, I was being told, look at you, you're this big reporter, but you're so stupid if people only know how stupid you are. Look at you, you think any man go want you, look how fat and ugly you're looking. And there was just that domination, just that putting down all the time. And the state I was in, I started to believe these things. I believed these things for years.
Many victims who have sought refuge in halfway houses are forced to return to abusive lives because they have children and are economically dependent on their abusers.
You could say about 50% would go back. Sometimes in some cases you have more women going back. Because in most cases they don't stay, some of them don't stay long enough to go through with the counseling and the intervention that we offer. What we try to do is to empower women to stand on their own. You know, we help them to get public assistance because remember, when somebody is displaced, okay, there's a battering situation, you leave the battering situation, you come into halfway house with your children. A typical case we had recently, this woman with 5 children. You have to find schools for them, you have to find money to relocate them, like housing and all of that. In some cases where you can't help them, they go back because of the economic situation.
Yet, for decades, domestic violence, which cuts across race, class, and economic barriers, and is a major mental and physical health risk to women and children, has been dismissed as a family matter, a natural male response.
Married, and my husband always take it for granted that whatever he say must go. And I would try my best to please him. And it's never enough, it's never good enough. He would always pull me down and tell me, you know, I'm not performing the duties of a wife. So it's as though I have to be a slave. I feel my duties are slave-wise.
Beginning, I remember one of the first incidents landed me in hospital because there was a dispute over the way I prepared some red beans. And my response led to me being hit so hard in the face that my nose was broken. I remember well that everything went black. When people talk about seeing stars, I saw stars. I just went blank with the blow. It was so severe. I suffered a broken nose. Blood was pouring out of my nose and just all over the place. It was awful. And yet I went to the hospital and I told them I fell down. I was just too ashamed at that point to say, my husband did this to me.
We say domestic violence, and I want to say sexual abuse. And what we have been seeing in recent times is that there has been an enormous increase in sexual abuse of young girls under 16. In fact, the statistics will show that there have been more than 100% increase over the last year. And under 13 too, there is also an enormous increase in that regard. And it means something is happening in the society that needs looking at.
Stepfathers, of course, find this part of life because they feel that if they're taking care of a teenage daughter, they have a responsibility, and in some cases, sons too. The sons are buggered and so on. Yes, this is happening, and it's happening with people who know you, and people who you feel betray you because they're supposed to be responsible for you. The other part of it is that in the Sexual Offences Act, it is rape to have sexual intercourse with your wife if she does not want to have it. It is rape. Okay. And that many women don't seem to understand that a man can come in and he's drunk or so and he feels that he can use you, or at a time when you don't feel well enough or strong enough at the time and you say no, and he does have sexual intercourse with you, he has raped you.
It's a mistake for us to assume that it's homogeneous, that it's the same exact thing in every single situation. It isn't. There's a great many different irons in the fire. And depending on the situation, you have different things that come into play.
Yes, but the commonality of it is this situation of the man wanting the power. We talked about rape, and we know that rape is more about power rather than about sex. And again, you know,
again, though, that's a
why
simplification.
is power so important
but
to
it's
men?
a simplification. Some men don't see it as power, they see it as self-defense.
Self-defense, when you bash a woman's head in.
I'm not justifying. I'm the last person that will justify. I'm telling you how they portray and they try to rationalize their own behavior. All right? And from their perception, they feel that they are seeking some kind of justifiable retribution, or they are acting in self-defense against a woman whose tongue is far more biting than any blow that he may strike back.
There was a time when it was legal in a country like the United States to beat your wife. That, and therefore I'm saying it's a kind of attitude that has been handed down. It was legal to beat your wife. If she brought you before a court or before a judge, the judge says it's fine, you can beat your wife. But there is one condition. And that condition is, whatever stick you use must be no thicker than the thumb of the judge. So it's a kind of, it's societal, it's traditional, it's cultural, and there are many who still believe that it's quite all right. You can batter your wife or your children. It's one way of keeping them in line, or she provoked me.
Police viewed it as a waste of time, taking the report, initiating proceedings, and then the husband and the wife meet up, and the case goes down the drain.
Trinidad and Tobago only passed the Domestic Violence Act in 1991, an act which, because it was met with so much resistance, was considerably watered down and ultimately lacked teeth.
I mean, there were questions about a woman taking action to have a spouse excluded from a home, and getting exclusion orders and so on. So there were a lot of people who felt it was going a bit too far at that time. So that with the highly reported incidents of domestic violence in the last year or two, we felt that we needed to look at this again, to give it more strength, to widen it. There were difficulties with simple things like an appeal, for example. Here you would have a situation, here is a mother in a home, is battered. She goes to the court, she gets an order, a protection order in the court under the Domestic Violence Act, and the spouse appeals. And when the spouse appeals, it means that the order is stayed. What does that mean? It means she has no protection whatsoever. I mean, how could that be?
The Act does not provide any one definition of domestic violence, but it does have 3 categories of behavior which fall under the Domestic Violence Act. The first is actual physical violence. For example, attempted rape, rapes, wounding, offenses against a person generally, attempted murder. That's one category of offenses which brings one under the Domestic Violence Act. The second type are threats of physical violence, and the third type is the more psychological violence, that of intimidation, abusive language, threatening language, depriving a person of their property, following them from place to place, to stalking. So you could say there's the physical violence, the threat of physical violence, and the psychological violence.
It excluded what is a very common reality in our societies, in fact in all Caribbean societies, the common law spouse. Common law spouse would have some difficulty in obtaining an order.
In other countries, what they have tried to do is develop protocols for public health officers and for police officers. So when a woman comes to you and the circumstances look suspicious, you initiate some sort of investigative procedure. In fact, in some countries, there's even mandatory reporting for public health officials. Now, we have not gone that route, but it may be something that we have to consider.
Right.
Not mandatory charging, but certainly mandatory investigation, and then counseling and other support services thereafter.
The role of the police can make the difference between life and death. Yet, by their own admission, the police has been in the past insensitive to victims of domestic violence.
I would say that some matters were really handled insensitive, and I think it is changing.
In 1996, the Minister of National Security, Joseph Theodore, was quoted as saying, "Up to today, the police are unclear on how to react when a child or spouse comes to the police and claims abuse." Other complaints against the police included lack of privacy during interviews with victims, lack of police protection, and even refusal to take domestic violence reports.
Police were never trained in counseling, and as a matter of fact, police didn't even see that as a function of the job. So that police dealt with matters of law. An offense is committed, somebody assaulted somebody, police will take a statement and have the matter placed before the court. There was no question of how the person felt. That was not an issue. If an offense was committed, you dealt with it.
Women's groups and NGOs who have provided shelter, counselling and rehabilitation for battered women and their children renewed their call for stronger legislation. Drastic measures were obviously needed. In December 1996, community policing was launched in 9 districts nationwide. 300 police officers were trained in counselling and legal rights of victims by experts. 8 months later, police records show that some 950 families have been counselled since its inception.
We are trying to bring to the family or to the homes or to the environment a more wholesome approach to community. We want to ensure that people feel like people and that we can get rid of some of the abuse that exists within communities. We want to make communities more wholesome. Communities where people can live without fear, in safety, and with some measure of security.
By June 1997, the rising incidence of domestic violence reached a crisis point. After yet another gruesome domestic murder, Police Commissioner Kenny Mohammed issued a statement calling on the entire country to get involved to stop the violence. The police commissioner admitted that although the matter was brought to the attention of the police and the suspect counselled, he still went on to execute his violent act.
The high incidence of domestic violence being committed in this country. Basically, the difficulties as practitioners, as lawyers out there dealing with the legislation, it became very clear that it was inadequate, it was deficient in many regards, and it needed some kind of review.
Later that month, a 19-member cabinet-appointed ad hoc committee for the reform of the Domestic Violence Act presented its recommendations to its chairman, the Minister of Legal Affairs, Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bissessa. Chief among them accorded greater powers to the police, including 1. The power to intervene to prevent injury or death, arrest any suspect and keep that person in custody during a cooling-off period. 2. The power to arrest a suspect without a warrant if police believes the suspect is about to commit an offence. 3. The power to charge a person for a criminal offence if assault resulting in injury has occurred and where serious threat by a suspect causes the victim to reasonably fear death or injury. 4. That an appeal against a protection order should not operate as a stay unless the Court of Appeal determines otherwise.
We widened definitions, procedurally as well. I think we've strengthened the Act in terms of procedures. I mean, a lot of recommendations that we've made, and as I say to you, almost half the report contains recommendations.
Right. The committee's report for amendments to the Domestic Violence Act is to be circulated for public comment before being placed before Parliament. But in domestic violence, there are no guarantees.
For this particular piece of legislation, how effective is it? We cannot say at this time. We have no statistics since 91 when this legislation was enacted. There are no statistics, in terms of, no research in terms of has this acted as a deterrent or not. What we've seen is an increase in the number of applications being made to the court.
If the matters come before the police in a way that the police can help to resolve the issues, then we might be able to deter one of the victims in this matter or the assailant in the matter from perpetrating his act. In other cases, it is sheer impossible to deal with some of them. Some may just snap, occasions may just lend itself to violence, and no one could assist in such matters.
A 1996 study compiled by a Canadian men's group called Montreal Men Against Sexism has concluded that the best way to stop men from battering is to support women who are victimized.
I noticed that you are badly bruised all over and so on. I guess it's what happened this morning when you told me that your husband had beaten you up. And would you like to seek medical attention now, or you would like to talk to me for a few minutes first? You want to talk to me for a few minutes first? Okay. Now, everything that you say now will be taken in the strictest confidence. In other words, your husband, or your neighbors, or anyone would not know what happened between you and your husband earlier on, or whatever you tell me today.
Sure.
I'm very sure of that, ma'am. I'm very sure of that. Now, based on the report you made, you have several options, one of which you can seek counseling sessions from us. Now, if you would like to have those counseling sessions, we'll make the necessary arrangement where, one, you can either come here to our office, or if you feel more comfortable at home, we can visit your home and have both you and your husband counsel. On the other hand, if after the counseling session it doesn't work out, we can take him before the court under the Domestic Violence Act and have you take out a protection order. In fact, that protection order means you can restrain him from getting close to you, a person, or to your house, or even to your place of work. If, on the other hand, he should break that order, he'll be arrested and taken before the court to be dealt with according to law. In fact, he can be sent to prison.
I prefer your counseling to start.
You prefer the counseling sessions to start. Okay? Now, in the meantime, I noticed that you are sort of scared. Are you scared of being at home alone or with the children together?
Yeah.
You are scared of being at home. Okay, now in the meantime, we can make arrangements also to have you stay at one of our halfway houses. He would not know where that house is. Where we have, in fact, we do something called networking with other non-governmental organizations known as NGOs. So we can have, for example, Rape Crisis Center, Family Services, and he would not know of these locations. I can assure you of that.
Canadian criminologist Anne Jones has written, "Battering is not just a series of isolated blow-ups or a lacking of skills on the part of abusers. Rather, it is a process of deliberate intimidation intended to coerce the victim to do the will of the victimizer. The batterer is not just losing his temper, not just suffering from stress, nor is he provoked by something the victim did. They are perfectly in control when they are abusive and could choose not to be violent. Still, there are no conclusive findings as to why men batter."
I really wish you knew, because the kinds of people who you see are perpetrators, you wonder. And when they come before you for counsel, they honestly, some of them weep and say they don't know why they did it, you know? But it is a power consciousness, it's a way of controlling that here I am, this is how I can get at you.
In the meantime, the victim of domestic violence has one viable solution.
Turning point was when we had a gas stove, and he lit the fire, and he was attempting to push my face into an open fire. And I remember that time I wore my hair a lot longer than it is now. So there was this nice ponytail to hold on to and try to push. And somewhere in the middle of all that, through all the fear, and so I realized, but this man wants to really destroy me. And I suppose some protective, something kicked in at that point. And that was when I really fought back, and I ended up that very day leaving and going to my mother's house, going to my parents' house, and I never looked back after that. That was it. That was the step out. That was the push I needed. And he called and he begged, and I said, no, I'm not coming back, and I never did.
It's time to get out. Get out and stand up for what you believe in, because no woman should be abused by any man at all, no matter what the situation is. I left right away because I always made up my mind that no woman should be ever lashed. It doesn't matter what they do. They're not dogs, they're not cats. They're human beings, and they should be treated as one.
Trinidad and Tobago has 7 shelters for battered women, 2 branches of the Rape Crisis Society, and 4 toll-free hotline numbers.